Good afternoon, students. Now, this is the fourth part of the second chapter, that is sexual reproduction in the flowering plants. In this, we will discuss the three topics. The first is the agent of pollination, second is pollen pistil interaction, third is the artificial hybridization. There are certain agents of pollination. First is the pollination by wind, and it is known as anemophily. These flowers which are pollinated by winds have the certain adaptations. First is the wind pollinated flowers with the single ovule in each ovary, so that they are small in size and large number of flowers remain together in an inflorescence. For example, in the case of the corn cob, so they are packed very closely to each other. Flowers are not so devoid of the scent nectar, since they do not need to attract the insects. Therefore, they do not have either color, scent, or nectar. They produce a large number of the pollen grains. For example, 5 lakhs in cannabis. Some of the pollen grains are the wings. For example, in the case of the pine, the pollen grains are winged. You might have observed during the spring season, that is February, March, April, the pine trees, they shed their pollen grains, which are yellow in color. They when fall on the ground, the surface becomes yellowish in color, and this yellow color resembles the sulfur, and hence it is called the sulfur sour. That is a shed of the pollen grain by the pine tree. The pollens are dry and unwettable, that is, they do not get moist by the water. If they fall in the water, they remain on the surface of the water. The stigma has to trap the maximum number of the pollen grains, so stigma becomes sticky, hairy, feathery, and branched. For example, in the coconut, palm, maize, grasses, and cannabis, the pollination takes place by the queen. Now the second is the pollination with the water, and this is called the hydrophily. They also have the certain adaptations in this. So pollination generally takes place in the submerged plants like the hydrilla and Cerodophilium, Melisneria, etc. The pollen grains are very thin, long thread-like, and they lack exine. The female flowers are of large size on the long stalk, so that they come up on the surface of the water. Anther abscisses at the base, means anther get detached from the base and it floats on the surface of the water, and the pollens are shed on the surface of water, and then it reaches the female stigma of the female flower. Pollination by insect is called the entomophily, that takes place in the roses and yucca. Flowers are brightly colored and produce nectar and fragrance. Smell is there, so that the insects are attracted. Stigma and pollen grains are sticky. The nectar is used as a reward to the insects, so the insects get attracted towards the flowers. Moth and yucca, moth a kind of insect, and yucca flower, they help each other to complete their life cycle. That is, moth when come to the yucca flower, it pollinates the flower. At the same time, the yucca flower provides the food for the larva of the moth. The pollination by the birds is known as ornithophily. It takes place in the bombyx, red silk cotton and bottlebrush. Flowers produce large amount of nectar to attract the bird. Generally, the birds which take away the nectar from the flowers have the long beak. These flowers are brightly covered to attract the flowers or to attract the birds. Some flowers are with a funnel-shaped corolla. Due to the funnel-shaped corolla, the bird has to enter its beak into the funnel and to suck the nectar. During this, it transfers the pollen grain from the one flower to the other flower. Floral parts are commonly feathery. The pollination of the bat by the bat is known as chirodophily. It takes place in sasaga tree, Rhizatea pinnata and babel tree, Adansonia. Pollen pistil interaction. When the pollen lands on the stigma, there is a chemical interaction between the pollen and stigma. If stigma recognizes the pollen, then it germinates. Otherwise, it will not able to germinate. Suppose pollen grain of other species, other plant lands on the stigma, it will not germinate due to the interaction between the stigma and pollen. If it is recognized, it is compatible, then pollen germination takes place on the stigma to produce a pollen tube. Pollen grains are set generally at the two-cell stage. The two cells are vegetative cells and generative cell. The generative cell, as soon as the pollen tube is formed, it produces a pollen tube. Two gametes. The two gametes pass through the pollen tube and reach to the embryo sac, and this pollen tube enters into the embryo sac through the micropylar end, and then it through the synergy it reaches to the egg cell. If pollen tube enters through the micropyle, it is called the porogamy. If pollen tube enters through the chelazal end, it is called the chelazogamy. And if pollen tube enters through the integument, it is called the mesogamy. Artificial hybridization. It is a type of the cross pollination under controlled conditions by the human beings. It is done for the improvement of the crop. The pollen grains of the desired plants are transferred to the stigma of the other desired plant to get the new plant with the desired characters. So it is a cross pollination method. Generally, if the flower is bisexual, then the self-fertilization is prevented by the following method: emasculation, that is removal of the anthers from the bisexual flower bud before the anther diasis by the use of the pair of the forceps. So anthers are removed so that the self-fertilization will not take place. Next stage is bagging. Once we remove the anther, we cover the flower with the bag so that the unwanted pollen grains do not reach to the stigma of that flower. On maturation of the stigma of the bagged flower, the pollen grains from a selected flower are dusted on the stigma. Emasculation and bagging are not required if the flower is unisexual. Emasculation is not required, but bagging is required for the unisexual flowers. So emasculation is one step which is not required for the unisexual flowers, but emasculation and bagging is necessary for the bisexual flowers. So that is all for today.